Gerard Kinsella never made headlines, yet his shadow loomed over every street corner in Liverpool. Beside him, a network of ruthless dock workers, silent enforcers, and international traffickers turned a once proud city into the epicenter of Europe's most powerful cocaine empire. This is the story of how ordinary people became players in a global drug war, where loyalty was currency, trust was scarce, and one wrong move could mean death. Liverpool has always been a city shaped by the sea. Its history is tied to the rise and fall of global trade, with ships docking from every corner of the world. For generations, the city's docks bustled with life, work, and commerce, but as legitimate industries declined and containerization made traditional dock work obsolete, something darker began to fill the void. By the early 2000s, a new kind of cargo was slipping through the cracks, hidden not in plain sight but deep within legal shipments. Cocaine fresh from South America started arriving in increasing quantities almost unnoticed. It wasn't just a few kilos hidden in suitcases anymore. This was organized, deliberate, and highly professional. Liverpool's geographical position made it the ideal entry point. With established shipping routes, underfunded port security, and long-standing smuggling traditions dating back to post-war black markets, it didn't take long for traffickers to realize the opportunity. At first it was small-time crews moving low volumes. But as the purity of cocaine soared and the demand in the UK grew rapidly, so did the ambition of those involved. The drugs were concealed in crates of fruit, bolts of fabric, electrical goods, anything that looked boring enough to avoid inspection. Once inside, the packages would disappear into a sprawling network of runners, dealers, and middlemen. The scale was shocking. The money was life-changing. For many young men growing up in Liverpool's most deprived areas, this was the only path they saw. Jobs were scarce, futures limited, and the gangs offered what society couldn't: power, purpose, and fast cash. But this wasn't just street-level dealing anymore. This was logistics, strategy, a multi-tiered system that mimicked legitimate supply chains, and behind it all were individuals who understood both the streets and international trade. What made this wave different was how quiet it was. There were no turf wars at first, no public warnings, just whispers. Suddenly, small-time criminals had designer watches. Derelict houses became cash-counting bases. Families noticed their sons coming home with expensive trainers and no explanation. Something was shifting in the city, but few realized, in those early days, that Liverpool wasn't just becoming a hub for drugs. It was about to become one of the most important points on the global cocaine map. As the flow of cocaine into Liverpool intensified, so did the reach of those who sold it. Local gangs, once confined to their postcodes, saw an opportunity beyond the city. They didn't just want to dominate Liverpool, they wanted the country. What began as low-key trips to nearby towns soon evolved into a ruthless business model, known as county lines. At its core it was simple: set up a dedicated phone line, usually a cheap, disposable burner, and use it to supply drugs to smaller towns where demand was high, but competition was weak. The profits were immediate, and the risks felt manageable. Liverpool became a factory, churning out these lines. Each phone number represented a different crew, a new territory, and a fresh income stream. Young boys, some as young as 12, were recruited to carry the drugs, often by force or through grooming. They were sent out on trains and buses, carrying small wraps in their shoes or bodies, sometimes hundreds of miles away from home. Once there, they worked out of trap houses, often taken over from vulnerable addicts. These kids weren't just runners. They were foot soldiers in a growing empire. The lines were named, branded like companies. Some were known for fast delivery, others for strong product. Violence was used sparingly at first, but became common as competition grew. Robbery, stabbings, kidnappings, whatever it took to protect the line. With every town they expanded into, the money grew, and so did the paranoia. To stay ahead, the gangs adopted business tactics. Shifts were rotated, phones changed regularly, and anyone showing signs of weakness was dropped or worse. Behind it all were older gang members pulling the strings, rarely seen, always calculating. They invested in properties, front businesses, even holidays to mask the cash. For police forces in smaller towns, it was overwhelming. They weren't used to this level of organization or brutality. What they were witnessing was the spread of a system perfected in Liverpool, efficient, adaptable, and brutal. What started as local street dealing had become a franchised model of organized crime, and at the heart of it all were the lines, each one a direct artery, pumping drugs and violence into the country from a city that was quietly rewriting the rules of the drug trade. Behind the growing success of Liverpool's drug networks stood a figure few had seen, but everyone in the criminal world knew by name: Gerard Kinsella. He wasn't loud or flashy like others in the game. He didn't flaunt wealth or seek attention. Instead, he operated in silence, always in the background, always watching. To many he seemed more myth than man, a shadow pulling the strings while others took the fall. But those in the know understood. Kinsella was the architect. His background wasn't unusual. Raised in one of Liverpool's toughest estates, he learned early that strength and loyalty meant survival. In his younger days, he was known as a reliable enforcer, calm under pressure, brutally efficient, and loyal to no one but the highest bidder. Over time, he stopped taking orders and began giving them. He'd seen how short most criminal careers were, and he was hidden to build something bigger, smarter, and longer lasting. Kinsella's genius wasn't in violence, it was in structure. He saw the drug trade as a system that could be streamlined. He used his contacts to form direct links with international traffickers, cutting out unreliable middlemen. His crew didn't just import drugs, they controlled storage, transport, and distribution, with a focus on staying off the radar. He recruited clean drivers, used legitimate businesses as fronts, and invested heavily in burner phones and encrypted messaging. Despite the scale of his operation, there were almost no arrests tied directly to him. He never used the phones himself, never touched the product, never appeared on surveillance. Money was moved through offshore accounts, properties were bought in relatives' names, and instructions were passed down face to face. It was as if he existed outside the system. Still, rumors circulated. Some said he had ties to corrupt officials. Others believed he was protected by cartels from Colombia or Mexico. Police placed him on multiple watch lists, but there was never enough to charge him. Every time someone got close, they either disappeared or refused to talk. For nearly a decade, Kinsella's name was untouchable. His empire was vast, his movements unpredictable. But like every system built on secrecy and control, it only took one misstep to start the unraveling, and that moment was coming. In 2009, everything changed with a single shipment. It was meant to be a routine delivery, one of many containers arriving at the Liverpool docks from Brazil, filled with processed meat and other perishable goods. But hidden deep within the container, concealed inside frozen packaging, was something far more valuable: over 200 kilograms of high-purity cocaine. The shipment was carefully planned, tracked by encrypted messages, and timed to move through customs, unnoticed, as it had many times before. But this time, something went wrong. The container never reached its destination. At first, there was confusion. The tracking information showed the container had cleared customs. But when Kinsella's people went to collect it, it had vanished. Port staff were questioned, drivers traced, but the container was gone. Within days, panic turned to bloodshed. A dock worker was found dead in his car, shot twice in the chest. A mid-level courier was discovered in a canal, his hands bound, his phone smashed. Then a known distributor disappeared completely. No trace, no body. These weren't warnings, they were messages. Someone inside the network had taken the shipment, but who had the nerve, and more importantly, the resources, to pull it off? As pressure mounted, it became clear that the product hadn't left the port at all. It had been rerouted, hidden in a separate warehouse by a rival crew operating quietly under Kinsella's radar. The theft wasn't random, it was strategic. a calculated move by an ambitious faction looking to break free and claim their piece of the empire. The move triggered an internal war. The stolen cocaine was quickly broken down and distributed, flooding the market with underpriced, high-purity product. Kinsella's line was compromised, customers were switching, profits were falling, the once stable empire had cracks, retaliation was swift and surgical. Safe houses were raided, cars were burned. A known associate of the rival crew was shot outside a gym in broad daylight. As Liverpool's internal war escalated, investigators began tracing the origins of the stolen shipment. What they uncovered led them far beyond Merseyside. Intelligence flagged unusual activity tied to the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Europe's busiest and most secure shipping hub. It turned out that the rival crew who had intercepted Kinsella's shipment weren't acting alone. They had backers, and those backers were operating across international waters. Rotterdam had quietly become the main European gateway for cocaine arriving from South America. Its massive container yards, high traffic volume, and complex logistics systems made it nearly impossible for authorities to inspect every shipment thoroughly. For traffickers, it was the perfect storm: modern infrastructure, vast scale, and deep corruption. The Dutch connection ran through a tight-knit group of Moroccan Dutch traffickers, known for their efficiency, brutality, and direct ties to Colombian suppliers. They had experience, weapons, and money. These groups weren't interested in the street-level chaos Liverpool was facing. They worked quietly, using encrypted phones, offshore shell companies, and third-party logistics firms. They moved hundreds of kilos at a time, distributing across Europe with minimal exposure. International agencies. Some were traced to bribes, others to sheer intimidation. One officer reported being followed home for weeks after raising concerns. The message was clear: keep quiet or face the consequences. What made the entire operation so effective was its simplicity. No dramatic heists, no armed takeovers, just quiet corruption in the right places. The gangs didn't need to smuggle drugs across borders in secret. They had turned the border itself into an open door. By the time law enforcement pieced it together, tens of millions of pounds worth of cocaine had already moved through the port and disappeared into the streets of Britain. The system hadn't failed. It had been bought. Amid the chaos and growing violence, a new lead emerged. One that didn't come from the streets, ports, or informants, but from a quiet financial institution on the Isle of Man. A forensic accountant working for a private bank noticed a pattern of irregular transactions tied to several Liverpool-based shell companies. At first, they looked like ordinary transfers, modest amounts, moving between construction firms and consulting agencies. But when she traced the money further, the paper trail led to offshore accounts in Panama, Cyprus, and the British Virgin Islands. Digging deeper, she uncovered something staggering. Over 300 million pounds had been laundered over just 5 years. The money moved in small, calculated steps through a network of fake companies, investment fronts, and betting shops. Some firms existed only on paper. Others had office addresses that led to abandoned buildings. The names of directors were fake, sometimes stolen from real people who had no idea their identities had been used. She compiled her findings into a report and passed it on to UK authorities, planning to testify. But before she could speak publicly, she vanished. She had traveled to Spain for a short holiday, hiking alone in a national park. When she didn't return, a search was launched. Her belongings were found near a cliff edge, and the case was ruled a tragic accident. No body was recovered. It didn't take long for investigators to grow suspicious. Months later, a breakthrough came when Dutch police cracked an encrypted phone network used by high-level criminals. Among the recovered messages was one referencing the numbers girl who had gone quiet. Another message warned to make sure the trail ends with her. The implications were clear. Her disappearance hadn't been an accident. The information she left behind, however, could not be buried. Her findings were enough to trigger multiple raids on suspect laundering operations. A betting shop in Toxteth was found with hidden ledgers detailing massive cash inflows. A luxury car dealership was exposed as a front, with more money passing through its accounts than it had sold vehicles in 5 years. While the streets of Liverpool were drenched in visible violence, the real power was moving silently through financial systems. The accountant had seen it clearly and paid the price. Her work would become the first real crack in the financial wall protecting the empire. By 2014, the scale of the Liverpool network had outgrown the city. It stretched across borders, masked by fake businesses, corrupt officials, and encrypted communication. The cocaine empire was no longer just a British problem. It had become a European one. That year, British and Dutch authorities launched a joint operation under the codename Operation Redwood. It would be the most ambitious and complex crackdown ever attempted against a UK-based drug network. With one goal: dismantle the entire structure from top to bottom. The planning took over a year. Undercover agents were embedded in key locations, surveillance teams monitored suspects in Liverpool, Rotterdam, and Madrid, and cyber units worked around the clock to decode messages from the encrypted phones. The breakthrough came when one of the Dutch traffickers slipped up and used a compromised device to send a logistics update. It revealed container numbers, drop-off locations, and most importantly, a delivery schedule that tied directly to Liverpool. Once the messages were verified, authorities moved quickly. Within 72 hours, coordinated raids took place across 6 countries. In Liverpool, police hit stash houses, fake businesses, and private homes all at once. In Rotterdam, shipping containers were seized. In Spain, a villa tied to one of the main financiers was raided and found filled with cash, weapons, and documents. Over 80 arrests were made, including mid-level enforcers, traffickers, launderers, and several dock workers with long histories of corruption. But one man was missing: Gerard Kinsella. His house was empty. His vehicles were gone. His offshore accounts had been drained weeks earlier. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in months. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. Intelligence suggested he may have fled to South America, possibly using a fake passport and assistance from the very cartels he once worked with. Despite his disappearance, the operation was hailed as a success. Authorities had finally torn apart the machinery that had turned Liverpool into one of Europe's key drug hubs. But even as arrests were made and assets frozen, investigators knew the story wasn't over. The drugs would keep coming, someone else would rise. And with Kinsella gone, a dangerous void had opened, one that others would be desperate to fill. The aftermath of Operation Redwood sent shockwaves through Liverpool. With so many key players arrested or forced into hiding, the carefully controlled drug empire that had dominated the city for over a decade suddenly fractured. But instead of peace, the city was plunged into chaos. The power vacuum left by the arrests ignited a brutal turf war among smaller gangs, desperate to claim territory and control the lucrative cocaine trade. Unlike the tightly run network that had once operated with ruthless efficiency, these new groups were reckless and violent. Car bombs became an alarming reality, exploding in residential areas and business districts alike. Shootings in broad daylight terrified communities and made headlines across the country. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire, and families lived in constant fear. Local schools increased security measures, with police patrols regularly stationed outside. Parents stopped letting their children play outside, and many sought to move away if they could afford to. The drug trade wasn't just a criminal problem, it had become a public safety crisis. The violence wasn't the only issue. With no central control over supply chains, purity levels of cocaine fluctuated wildly. Some dealers cut the drugs dangerously low with harmful additives, leading to a spike in overdoses and hospital admissions. Prices soared as gangs struggled to maintain consistent supply routes. For many addicts, the crisis meant an even darker spiral. Law enforcement agencies struggled to keep up. The dismantling of one empire had only created dozens of smaller fragmented groups, harder to track and predict. Community trust in the police eroded as violence continued unabated. Some officers felt overwhelmed, outgunned and outnumbered. Amid the chaos, Whispers spread that a new player was trying to unite the gangs under a single banner, someone more ruthless than those before. But without the resources and connections that Kinsella had, the city seemed destined to descend further into disorder. Liverpool's cocaine war had left more than just headlines. It had left scars, broken families, shattered communities, and a city struggling to reclaim itself from an epidemic that refused to die. The empire may have been broken, but the addiction, violence, and fear lingered on. Years after the collapse of the original empire, Liverpool began to show signs of slow recovery. New community groups emerged. Local charities increased support for addiction services, and police forces invested in intelligence-led operations to tackle the fractured gangs. The city, battered but resilient, fought to rebuild itself. Yet beneath the surface, the cocaine trade had not disappeared, it had transformed. The global drug market continued to evolve, with new routes opening up and synthetic drugs gaining popularity. But cocaine remained a highly profitable commodity, and Liverpool still held a key place in its distribution across the UK and beyond. The city's ports were busier than ever, with container ships arriving from South America and Africa, carrying legal goods and illicit cargo alike. Smugglers adapted, using ever more sophisticated methods to avoid detection, hidden compartments in vehicles, drones, even fake agricultural shipments. Technology became both a tool and a weapon. Law enforcement learned from past mistakes. Instead of just targeting low-level dealers, they began focusing on the financial networks that sustained the trade. Cross-border cooperation improved, with Europol and other agencies sharing intelligence faster and more efficiently. The lessons of corruption within the port led to stricter oversight and regular audits. Community policing efforts aimed to build trust and encourage cooperation with investigation. But the deeper problem remained: the demand. Without addressing the social and economic conditions that pushed so many into the drug trade or addiction, the cycle continued. Young people in deprived areas still saw few opportunities, and gangs continued to offer power and money. The cocaine empire of the early 2000s had left a legacy, one of wealth, violence, and corruption, that still cast a long shadow. Liverpool had changed, but the forces that shaped its darkest years had not disappeared entirely. Instead, they had learned, adapted, and moved on. The city was still a crucial piece in the global cocaine puzzle, a reminder that while empires can fall, the trade they build is far harder to destroy. The story of Liverpool's cocaine networks is not just one of crime and punishment, but a warning of how global systems and local realities intertwine in ways that challenge every city in the